The evening was quiet, and the restaurant glowed with golden light spilling through tall windows. Expensive cars lined the entrance outside, and inside, polished marble floors reflected the shine of crystal chandeliers. Waiters moved quickly in their neat uniforms, placing glasses of wine and plates of food on polished tables where wealthy guests sat talking, laughing, and showing off their importance. It was the kind of place where every detail screamed luxury, and only those who looked like they belonged usually walked through the doors. And then, the door opened, and everything shifted. An old black man stepped inside. His steps were slow, steady, but filled with dignity. He wore a simple, slightly worn coat, and his shoes carried the marks of many journeys. His hair was silver, and his face showed lines carved by years of experience. He did not rush, nor did he lower his eyes. He looked around with calmness as if he had every right to be there. But the room told him otherwise. Conversation softened, then paused. People turned their heads, their eyes moving up and down, judging silently. A few eyebrows raised and whispers started at the tables closest to the entrance. Some diners leaned closer to one another, speaking under their breath. "What is he doing here?" one muttered. Another smirked. "He must be lost." Their voices carried just enough to be heard. The old man ignored them, keeping his focus on the empty tables ahead. To him, it was a restaurant like any other. To them, it was a place he didn't belong. The waiter at the front froze for a moment, then forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He hesitated before stepping forward, clearly surprised that someone so ordinary had walked into such a polished place. Behind him, a group of young diners laughed softly, their eyes following the man as though his presence was entertainment. The old man didn't look at them. His back remained straight, his pace calm. He was not in a hurry, nor did he seem embarrassed. There was no nervous shifting, no sign of fear. His presence carried quiet strength, though no one else noticed it yet. They saw only what they wanted to see, an outsider stepping into their world. As he moved deeper inside, the clinking of cutlery slowed. A woman in a bright dress wrinkled her nose, whispering to her companion about his out-of-place appearance. The companion chuckled, shaking his head, amused by the sight. The room, once full of easy laughter and proud conversation, now seemed to hum with tension. Every glance toward the old man carried doubt, curiosity, or cruel amusement, yet he walked on. Each step he took was deliberate, as though he were not entering a stranger's space but returning to a place that was his by right. There was no begging in his eyes, no apology in his posture. The whispers grew louder behind him, but still, he carried himself with quiet dignity. The staff exchanged quick looks, unsure of how to handle the situation. The man had not spoken a word yet, had not made any demand, had not caused any disturbance. And yet his presence alone was enough to unsettle the room. A few diners chuckled again, their laughter sharper this time, as if mocking him would confirm that he truly didn't belong there. But the old man paid no attention. He had faced far heavier storms in his life than whispers and stares. His face, calm and unreadable, gave away nothing. The restaurant was meant to intimidate him, to remind him of his place in society. Instead, he walked as though he owned the very floor he stepped on. No one in that room knew who he was. They saw only the surface, an elderly man dressed simply, walking into a space that others believed was reserved for the wealthy, the powerful, the ones who fit in. They laughed because they thought they understood his story. They whispered because they thought they had the right to decide who belonged and who didn't. But in that moment, the truth was invisible to them. They didn't know that the man they mocked carried an identity far greater than anyone in that room could imagine. For now, all they saw was an old man stepping into a world they thought was too bright for him. And for now, that was enough to make them laugh. Yet if anyone had looked closer, if anyone had truly seen the calm strength in his walk, the quiet fire in his eyes, they might have thought twice before whispering. They might have realized that this man was not there by accident. He was there with purpose, and his presence was about to test every assumption they held. The old man reached the center of the restaurant. The laughter behind him still flickered like cruel sparks, but he did not falter. He had walked through harder doors than this one, and what awaited these people was a lesson they would never forget. The waiter stood frozen for a second, his forced smile trembling at the edges. He had served rich men, businessmen in sharp suits, glamorous women with diamond necklaces, and tourists ready to spend thousands on a single evening. But this, an old black man in a faded coat, this was something he had never expected. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice but making sure the nearby diners could still hear. "Sir," he began, his tone polite only on the surface. "I think you may be lost. This isn't really the kind of place for, you know." His eyes flickered over the man's worn shoes and plain clothes. The words were careful, but the meaning was clear. "You don't belong here." The old man looked at him calmly, his silver brows lifting just a little. "I'd like a table," he said simply, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of a man who had repeated those words countless times in countless places. The waiter's fake smile cracked. He hadn't expected confidence. Behind him, a few customers chuckled. One woman covered her mouth as she whispered, "He actually wants to eat here." Another diner, a young man in a designer suit, laughed openly, shaking his head as if the sight of the old man was the funniest thing he'd seen all week. The waiter stiffened, now more determined to get rid of this problem. He raised his voice sharper this time. "Sir, this restaurant is fully booked. We don't have any tables available. Perhaps you should try somewhere else down the street." The old man didn't flinch. He didn't step back. He repeated in the same calm tone, "I said I'd like a table." For a brief moment, the waiter's composure slipped. The boldness startled him. No begging, no apologies, just quiet insistence. His jaw tightened. If he gave in, the diners watching would mock him for letting an outsider sit among them. If he stood firm, he would earn their approval. He made his choice. The waiter stepped closer, his fake smile completely gone. "Sir, let me say this again more clearly. This isn't a place for you, so I'm asking you to leave now." His voice rang louder across the polished dining hall, and laughter bubbled up from the wealthy diners who were enjoying the scene as if it were a performance put on for them. The old man's eyes stayed locked on the waiter, calm, unshaken. His voice didn't rise, but somehow it felt heavier than before. "Are you refusing to serve me?" he asked. The question was simple, but it made the waiter's throat dry. "Yes," the waiter snapped, his patience gone. "Get out before I call security." The restaurant buzzed with cruel energy. Some guests leaned back in their chairs enjoying the show. A man at a nearby table smirked and whispered, "Look at him, thinking he deserves to sit with us." Another clinked his glass against his friends, laughing. This is what happens when people forget their place. The waiter, fueled by the approval of the diners, took another step closer to the old man. His hand twitched as though ready to grab the man's arm and drag him out if needed. "Do you understand me? You don't belong here. Leave now." The room seemed to pause for a heartbeat. Every eye was on the old man, waiting to see if he would crumble under the humiliation, if he would lower his head and walk out in shame. The laughter still echoed softly, daring him to surrender, but he didn't move. His expression remained steady, his posture strong. He looked straight into the waiter's eyes, not with anger, but with a kind of patience that unsettled everyone who saw it. He stood not as a man defeated, but as a man who knew something they did not. The waiter's voice rose one last time, sharp and cruel now. "Get out!" he barked, loud enough for the chandeliers to tremble with the sound. The room erupted in laughter once again. A group of young women giggled, one of them whispering, "This is embarrassing." Another diner, older, smirked and added, "He probably doesn't even have enough money to pay for water." The old man still didn't move. His silence was louder than their laughter. His calmness was heavier than the waiter's cruelty. In that moment, a strange unease flickered across a few faces in the room. They didn't know why, but something about the way he stood there so still, so certain, made them feel that the story was not as simple as they thought. The waiter, however, blinded by arrogance and pride, didn't notice. He only saw an opportunity to prove his authority in front of his wealthy audience, and so, with his voice like a whip, he demanded once more, "Leave. You are not welcome here." The old man finally moved, but only to straighten his back, lifting his chin slightly. His eyes scanned the room for the first time, sweeping across every mocking face, every smirk, every pair of eyes filled with judgment. The laughter began to waver just slightly, as if people suddenly felt that they had laughed too soon, too easily. And though he said nothing more, his silence carried a promise. A storm was coming. The laughter lingered in the air like smoke, curling and twisting around the old man as he stood unmoving in the center of the room. The waiter smirked, thinking he had won, but he didn't realize the story was only beginning. The other diners leaned in closer, treating the humiliation as entertainment. They weren't whispering anymore. Their words grew bolder, sharper, and filled with open mockery. At one table near the window, a group of young businessmen laughed so loudly that other guests turned to look. One of them, his tie loosened and his glass half full, sneered. Maybe he's looking for free food. Probably thinks he'll get some leftovers. His friends chuckled, clinking their glasses together, proud of their cruelty. Across the room, a woman in a glittering dress leaned toward her companion. She lowered her voice just enough to be dramatic, but loud enough to be heard. "Look at his coat," she said with a fake smile. "It's older than the furniture here." Her partner laughed, nodding in agreement as if mocking the man made them shine brighter. The manager, a tall man in a perfectly pressed suit, stepped out from the back after hearing the noise. His stride was confident, his smile rehearsed. To the wealthy guests, he bowed slightly, apologizing for the disturbance. But when his eyes fell on the old man, the warmth in his face turned cold. He approached slowly, adjusting his tie, acting as if he were doing the restaurant a great service. "Sir," the manager said with false politeness, "this establishment has certain standards. Our guests expect a certain atmosphere." He looked the man up and down, making no effort to hide his disdain. "I believe you'd be more comfortable somewhere else." The old man's eyes flickered just slightly, but he remained calm. "I'd like to order dinner," he said again, his voice as steady as before. The manager's smile tightened. He was used to people bowing their heads, apologizing, and leaving quietly when confronted. But this man did not bend. His refusal to shrink away in shame irritated the manager deeply. He wanted to end the scene quickly, but the crowd was enjoying it too much. The whispers had turned into open jeers. "He should take a hint," one diner said loudly, not caring if the old man heard. "This isn't a charity kitchen," another added. "Someone call security already? We can't eat with this distraction standing here." The waiter, emboldened by the audience, folded his arms smugly, watching the man struggle against a wall of humiliation. He had no idea that his arrogance was about to collapse on itself. Still, the old man stood firm, saying nothing more. He didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than their insults. He didn't meet their mockery with anger. Instead, he looked around slowly, his gaze steady, unhurried. One by one, his eyes touched the faces of those who mocked him. For a split second, some of them shifted uncomfortably in their seats, though they quickly covered it with laughter. The cruelty continued. "Maybe he wandered in off the street," a man joked, his gold watch flashing under the chandelier. His wife giggled, sipping her champagne as if the scene were nothing more than a play put on for their amusement. The manager tried to maintain control of the room, bowing slightly to the wealthy guests as though to reassure them. But in truth, he was performing for them too, playing the role of protector of luxury. The old man, however, refused to give him that satisfaction. He did not beg, did not leave, did not even raise his voice. Instead, his calmness became heavier, like a weight pressing down on the room. The louder they laughed, the stronger his silence became. It unsettled the few who were watching closely. One young waitress in the corner bit her lip, her eyes darting nervously between the old man and the mocking crowd. She seemed to sense something the others didn't, that the man's stillness was not weakness, but power waiting to be revealed. The room buzzed with arrogance, the sound of people too sure of themselves, too blind to see the truth standing in front of them. To them, he was just an old man to laugh at, an uninvited guest they believed they could crush with their words. But they didn't know that every cruel remark, every mocking laugh was building toward a moment that would shatter their certainty. For now, they enjoyed their mockery. They saw themselves as winners, safe in their luxury, blind to the storm forming in silence. And in that silence, the old man's presence grew larger. He was no longer just a figure standing in their restaurant. He was a mirror, reflecting back their arrogance, their cruelty, their lack of humanity. The more they laughed, the more foolish they looked. But none of them realized it yet. Not yet. The laughter rolled through the restaurant like a wave, cruel and unkind. Yet the old man did not move. He stood there with the same quiet strength he had carried since stepping through the door. His silence was not weakness, it was steady, unshaken, almost unsettling. The waiter, now red with frustration, folded his arms and waited for him to leave. The manager, puffing up his chest, tried to mask his unease with authority. But then the old man spoke again, his voice calm and firm, cutting through the chatter like a blade. "I told you," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "I want a table. I have as much right to eat here as anyone else." The room stilled for a heartbeat, surprised by the strength in his tone. Then, as if on cue, more laughter erupted. Someone at the back clapped mockingly as though congratulating him for his boldness. A man in an expensive suit leaned forward, grinning. "Hear that? He thinks he belongs here." Another diner smirked. Maybe he saved a year just to buy a cup of soup. The waiter sneered openly now. "Sir, you don't seem to understand. We don't serve people like you here." His voice was sharper, fueled by arrogance and the approval of the room. "You're causing a scene. If you don't leave, we'll remove you." The old man did not flinch. Instead, he straightened his back, his shoulders squared as though he were rooted to the very ground beneath him. His calmness rattled them more than if he had shouted. He looked at the waiter directly, his eyes steady. "If you think I don't belong here," he said softly, "that says more about you than it does about me." A hush fell, brief but noticeable. Some diners shifted in their seats, uncomfortable. The words struck deeper than they wanted to admit. But the arrogance in the room quickly smothered that flicker of shame. The manager cleared his throat loudly, breaking the silence. "Enough of this," he declared. "You are disturbing my guests. Leave now before I call security." The old man's lips curved just slightly, not a smile, but something close to it. "If you truly believe I don't belong here," he replied, "then show me the rule that says so." The challenge hung heavy in the air. The manager blinked, caught off guard. There was no rule, of course, but he had never needed one before. Appearances had always been enough. Tonight, though, this man refused to bow, refused to apologize for existing. The mockery continued from the diners. A woman with pearls around her neck whispered loudly enough for the room to hear. He should know his place. Her husband chuckled and replied, "Men like him have no place in here." The cruelty was relentless. Yet it slid off the old man like rain off stone. What unsettled the staff most was that he did not raise his voice. He did not beg. He did not threaten. He simply refused to move. Every calm word he spoke felt like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the arrogance in the room. The waiter stepped closer, his face flushed with anger. He was used to winning these little battles, to showing outsiders the door. But something about this man's stillness made his own confidence falter. "Do you want to be dragged out?" He snapped. "Because that's what's about to happen." The old man didn't even blink. His reply was measured, each word carrying quiet weight. "No. What's about to happen is that you will regret the way you've treated me." The laughter wavered for the first time. A ripple of unease moved through the room. The words weren't loud, but there was something in his tone, something that suggested he was not the powerless man they believed him to be. Still, arrogance is a blinding thing. The diners laughed louder, trying to bury their discomfort. The manager raised his hand as if signaling for someone at the back. The waiter smirked, convinced the old man would finally be dragged out. But the old man did not move. He planted himself firmly, his chin lifted, his eyes sharp. His very presence was a refusal. And though no one admitted it yet, his calm defiance was beginning to turn the atmosphere in the room. It was no longer just mockery. It was a test of patience, of arrogance, of respect. And while the staff and diners thought they were in control, they were slowly realizing they were the ones being exposed. The old man's refusal to bend was the spark. Soon the truth would ignite. The tension in the restaurant had reached its peak. The old man stood tall, unshaken, his refusal still echoing in the air. The waiter glared at him, trembling with anger but also with something else, fear he could not admit. The manager, puffed up with false authority, waved impatiently toward the back of the restaurant, signaling for security to arrive. The wealthy diners leaned forward eagerly, waiting to see the intruder dragged out into the street. They wanted the humiliation to end with a spectacle. But then, just as the manager turned to call again, a sudden voice broke through the noise. "Wait!" A young waitress, breathless and wide-eyed, rushed from the kitchen doors, her tray nearly slipping from her hands. She stared at the old man, her expression shifting from shock to recognition. Her lips parted as though she couldn't believe her own eyes. The entire room turned toward her. The laughter fell silent, replaced by murmurs. The manager frowned, annoyed by the interruption. "What is it now?" he snapped. But the waitress ignored him. Her eyes stayed fixed on the old man, her hands trembling. Do you know who that is?" she whispered, her voice carrying farther than she intended. The room shifted uneasily. Diners exchanged puzzled looks. The waiter scoffed, folding his arms. "He's no one," he said quickly. "Just another old man causing trouble." But the girl shook her head, her voice growing steadier now, fueled by certainty. "No, he isn't just anyone." Her words sent ripples through the silence. Whispers spread among the tables like wildfire. "Who is he?" someone asked. Another leaned closer to their friend, whispering nervously, "What does she mean?" The arrogance that had filled the room only moments ago began to crack, replaced by something else. Confusion and a flicker of doubt. The manager tried to laugh it off, though his voice wavered. "Nonsense. He's nobody important. Just look at him." But the waitress stood her ground. "I've seen him before," she said firmly now. "His picture was in the paper. Her voice broke for a second under the weight of her discovery. Then she finished with trembling certainty. "He's the man who owns this entire chain of restaurants." The words landed like thunder. Gasps erupted around the room. Forks and glasses froze in midair. The laughter that had once filled the air collapsed into stunned silence. Every mocking smile, every cruel whisper, every arrogant smirk vanished in an instant. All eyes turned back to the old man, now seen in a completely different light. The waiter's face drained of color. His smirk disappeared, replaced by open fear. He stumbled a step back, his mind scrambling to undo the damage, but it was far too late. The manager's jaw dropped, his hands trembling as he realized what the waitress had said. His false confidence shattered, leaving only panic behind. The diners, who only moments ago had mocked and laughed, now sat frozen in their seats. Shame swept across their faces. The man with the gold watch lowered his arms slowly, no longer proud of his cruel jokes. The woman in pearls pressed her lips together tightly, her laughter silenced. Even those who had said nothing earlier now looked guilty for enjoying the scene. The old man, still calm, did not react to the chaos. He did not boast, nor did he gloat. He simply stood there, his presence heavier than ever, his silence forcing them all to confront their behavior. His dignity had remained unbroken from the start, and now the truth had revealed why. A cold hush filled the restaurant. The chandeliers still glowed, the silver still shone, but the air felt heavy, suffocating with regret. The people who had laughed now couldn't meet his eyes. Every whisper of mockery came rushing back to them, but this time not as jokes, this time as shameful echoes. The waiter opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His throat was dry, his arrogance turned to dust. The manager, pale and sweating, tried to step forward, but his knees wobbled. He had treated his employer, his master, with cruelty and disrespect in front of everyone. And the old man? He simply adjusted his coat and looked around, his steady gaze sweeping across the room once more. He didn't need to say a word. His silence told them all. You revealed yourselves before you revealed me. The shock was complete. The room that had once laughed now sat in silence, trembling under the weight of a truth they could never take back. The silence in the restaurant was thick, as though the very walls were holding their breath. Moments ago, laughter and arrogance had filled the air, but now every mocking face had fallen pale. The waitress's words still echoed in the minds of all present. He's the man who owns this entire chain of restaurants. The old man stood quietly, his hands folded before him, his posture strong and unbent despite the storm of humiliation he had endured. His eyes, steady and piercing, swept slowly across the room, pausing on each diner, each waiter, each person who had taken part in his disgrace. No words passed his lips, but the weight of his silence was heavier than thunder. The manager was the first to move, stumbling forward with a desperate, trembling smile. "Sir," he stuttered, his polished arrogance now replaced with panic. "Please forgive the misunderstanding. If I had known—" He stopped mid-sentence, choking on his own fear. His voice was shaking too much to continue. The waiter, who had shouted the words "Get out" so confidently just minutes ago, now looked as though the ground beneath him had vanished. He tried to step back quietly, hoping to disappear into the background, but the old man's gaze fell on him, steady and unblinking. The waiter froze, his breath caught in his throat. Finally, the old man spoke. His voice was calm, quiet, but it carried to every corner of the hall. You judged me by my coat. You judged me by my shoes. You judged me by my skin. And you laughed, believing you were better than me. He paused, letting the truth of his words sink deep into the hearts of all who listened. But respect, he continued, is not given to clothing or wealth. Respect is owed to every human being. The diners shifted uncomfortably. Some lowered their eyes, ashamed. Others covered their mouths, wishing their laughter had never been heard. Every insult, every chuckle, every cruel whisper now replayed in their minds with unbearable weight. The old man took a step forward, his calmness more powerful than any anger could ever be. I built this place, he said softly, his hand gesturing around the shining chandeliers, the polished tables, the fine carpets. Every brick, every plate, every chair exists because of the life I've lived and the work I've done. And yet, when I walked in tonight, none of you saw me. You saw only what you wanted to see, a man unworthy of sitting among you. The words cut deep. The wealthy diners who moments ago had reveled in mocking him, now felt smaller than they ever had before. The manager's hands shook at his sides. The waiter's eyes filled with silent terror. The old man's gaze moved once more across the room. Do you see now? He asked quietly. What you revealed tonight was not who I am. What you revealed was who you are. The restaurant was silent. No one dared to breathe too loudly, as though the very sound of their breath might expose them further. The waitress who had recognized him stood with tears in her eyes, her hands clasped tightly together. She had seen the truth before anyone else, and now the entire room had no choice but to face it. The old man's tone never rose, never cracked. His strength lay not in anger, but in truth, and truth is harder to escape than any punishment. He looked once more at the waiter who had humiliated him. You told me to get out, he said softly. But now it is you who stands out, not because of your strength, but because of your weakness. The waiter dropped his eyes, his face burning with shame. He wished for a hole in the ground to swallow him, but there was no escape. The diners too wished they could vanish, but the old man's words held them there, forcing them to see themselves clearly for the first time. No one laughed now. No one smirked. No one dared to whisper. The chandeliers still glowed above, but their light felt harsh, exposing every hidden cruelty in the room. And the old man, without shouting, without cursing, without raising a single hand, had revealed everything, the truth of who he was, the truth of who they were, and the truth of what respect really means. The restaurant, once buzzing with arrogance and laughter, now sat under a heavy blanket of silence. It was the kind of silence that pressed against the chest, made the air harder to breathe, and forced every person to confront themselves. Forks lay untouched. Glasses stood half raised, and no one dared to look too long at the old man who had just revealed the truth. Moments earlier they had laughed. They had mocked. They had treated him as though he were invisible, unworthy of being in their presence. Now those same mouths were shut, their throats tight, their pride crumbling under the weight of shame. The chandeliers still sparkled above, but the room no longer felt grand. The gold trim on the walls, the polished tables, the silver cutlery, all of it felt meaningless compared to the presence of one man who had stood firm against their cruelty. The waiter, once bold enough to bark, "Get out," now stared at the floor, his face pale. His hands, which had pointed toward the door moments ago, now shook slightly at his sides. He wanted to disappear, to melt into the marble tiles, but he could feel the old man's gaze on him. It was not a glare of anger, but a calm, steady look that pierced far deeper than fury ever could. The manager, too, had lost all of his false authority. His polished voice, once dripping with condescension, was gone. He shifted his weight nervously from foot to foot, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. For the first time in years, he found himself powerless in his own domain. Around the room, the wealthy diners sat frozen in their seats. A woman in pearls who had earlier giggled cruelly now clutched her napkin tightly, twisting it in her hands. The man with the gold watch lowered his wrist under the table, ashamed of how he had brandished it while mocking someone he now knew had built everything around him. Young businessmen who had clinked glasses at his humiliation now avoided one another's eyes, each one suddenly disgusted by their own behavior. The silence grew heavier with every passing second. It was not just quiet, it was punishment. Each person was left alone with the echo of their own laughter, replaying in their minds like a cruel mirror. And no matter how much they wished they could take it back, the truth remained. They had revealed themselves. The old man did not speak further. He did not need to. His silence filled the room with a lesson sharper than any lecture. Every second of his calm presence forced them to reflect on what they had done. His refusal to lash out, to shout, or to demand revenge made their shame even stronger. If he had yelled, they could have excused themselves, blamed the heat of the moment. But his quiet dignity left them without an escape. The waitress who had spoken up earlier stood near the corner, her hands clasped in front of her chest. Her eyes glistened with tears, but not of guilt, of pride. She was the only one who had seen the truth before it was too late. She had recognized the man not by his coat or his shoes, but by something deeper. And now she stood taller, knowing that while the others had mocked, she had chosen to speak. The old man finally shifted, pulling out a chair at one of the empty tables. The sound of the chair legs scraping against the marble floor was deafening in the silence. Slowly he sat down, his posture straight, his movements deliberate. He reached for the menu that no one had dared to offer him. The gesture alone was enough to tighten the shame in every heart present. The silence was total now. Even the clinking of glasses and soft background music had stopped, as if the very room itself knew it had witnessed something shameful. The diners sat with lowered eyes. The staff froze in place, and the weight of their actions hung over them like a shadow that would never leave. The laughter was gone. The arrogance was gone. All that remained was silence, heavy, suffocating, unforgettable. And in that silence, the lesson was already being carved into every soul present. Respect is not something you give only to those who look powerful. Respect is the minimum owed to every human being. The old man had not shouted. He had not demanded. He had simply refused to bend. And with nothing more than his silence, he had turned the grand restaurant into a courtroom of shame, where everyone sat guilty under the weight of their own cruelty. The old man sat quietly at the table he had claimed, his coat folded neatly on the back of his chair. The menu rested in his hands, but his eyes were not on the words. Instead, they swept slowly across the room once more, taking in the faces of every person who had mocked him, every smirk that had now collapsed into shame. The silence was still thick, heavy, pressing on their chests. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and steady, but it carried farther than any shout could. "You all laughed," he said, his tone quiet yet unshakable. "You looked at me and decided I was nothing. Because of my coat, because of my age, because of my skin, you thought you could decide my worth. And tonight, every one of you revealed more about yourselves than you did about me." Not a fork moved. Not a chair shifted. His words dropped into the silence like stones in a still pond, each ripple reaching deeper into the hearts of those who listened. The waiter lowered his head, his face flushed with humiliation. The manager's throat tightened, his hands twisted nervously. His earlier arrogance shattered into fragments too small to pick back up. The diners sat frozen, their luxury and wealth meaningless now under the weight of the old man's truth. He placed the menu gently on the table and folded his hands. Respect is not earned by money. It is not stitched into clothing or polished into shoes. It does not sit in jewels or shine in watches. Respect is owed to every soul, no matter who they are, where they come from, or what they carry on their backs. You may have wealth, but tonight you have shown poverty of character. A woman in pearls lowered her gaze to her lap, biting her lip to hold back tears. A young man who had jeered earlier now stared at the floor, wishing he could disappear. Every cruel whisper they had spoken came back to them, echoing louder in the silence than the chandeliers that glowed above their heads. The old man leaned back in his chair, his eyes still steady, his presence still commanding. "Do you know why I came tonight?" he asked softly. "Not for the food. Not for the wine. I came because I wanted to see how people treat a man when they believe he has nothing to offer them. And tonight you showed me your truth. You showed me who you are when you think no one is watching." The weight of his words crushed the room further. The manager's lips trembled, his polished professionalism useless now. The waiter's hands curled into fists at his sides, not in anger but in fear and shame. The diners shifted, unable to escape the mirror the old man had held up before them. And then, after a long pause, he gave them the final blow, the lesson that would never leave their hearts. Greatness is not in wealth. Power is not in status. True strength is in kindness. And tonight you chose cruelty. Remember this shame, because I will remember your faces, and so will you. A hush fell even deeper than before. as if the very walls of the restaurant had taken in his words and carved them into stone. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. The grand room, built to shine with elegance, now felt like a hall of judgment, and every person present was guilty. The old man rose slowly, his chair scraping softly against the marble floor. He adjusted his coat, placed a hand on the table for balance, and stood tall. His silver hair caught the chandelier light, glowing like a crown. He looked once more at the waiter who had shouted, "Get out!" The man could not meet his eyes. "Respect is not a favor," the old man said to him quietly. "It is a duty. Do not forget that again." He turned toward the door, his steps steady and unhurried, the same as when he had entered. But now every eye followed him, not with mockery, but with guilt, with awe, with silence heavy enough to last a lifetime. The door closed softly behind him, but the lesson he left behind stayed like a scar on every soul in that room. They would never forget how quickly their laughter turned to silence, how their arrogance dissolved in front of dignity, how an old man revealed to them that wealth means nothing without humanity. The chandeliers still glowed, the glasses still sparkled, but the restaurant was no longer the same. It had been turned into a classroom, and every person in it had been given the hardest lesson of their lives. And the man they had once laughed at walked away, stronger than ever, leaving behind a silence that would echo forever.